Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for U Sports football. Me and Tom are back on the mics with episode 2 of the exit meeting, breaking down the first of our two Toronto OUA football teams. It is the UofT Varsity Blues. Tom and I are rocking this one solo, but frankly, there's no one I'd rather be talking anything OUA football with. So before we dive into all that, Tom, how the heck you doing, my friend?
Oh, I'm doing well, my man. I'm doing well. We took a bit of a hiatus there after we put out the Waterloo pod, but I'm happy to be back into it. Talking OUA football and U Sports football. Nice little change to the intro there, my man.
It kind of just slipped out. And honestly, K Mac was such a stellar guest on the Waterloo pod. But as you were saying, there are certain things that we can kind of get into when it's just you and I. That when we have a guest, there's obviously certain things that we gain that are so great. And again, shout out to Coach McNeil. And in the intervening time, there were some pretty big signings out of the London region to Waterloo, to which you had quickly said, oh, maybe that's K-Mac already working his magic with that recruiting coordinator hat and, of course, with all his London background. So shout out to the Waterloo Warriors. Shout out to the London South Lions. But this is a UofT Blues podcast only. Tom, the 1-7 UofT Blues coming obviously just above the Waterloo Warriors at the bottom of the OUA standings this year, but the start of the coach DA time at UofT. Of course, our friend Tommy Kanichis, who joined us last year, his first year with the on the offense side of the ball. What are some of your first thoughts when you think about this 2024 season of UofT football?
I mean, going 1-7 for any coach is not going to be where you want to be, obviously. We know DA, we know Tommy, we know those guys at U of T, and they're not going to be satisfied with something like this in this season. However, getting that first win, albeit against their old teams in both Coach Kanichis and Coach DA, that's a huge one to start the season, and especially in the manner in which they got it. You and I both know it's one thing to get a win, but it's another thing to get a close win and in the manner that they did, because that instills so much confidence, that gets you a little bit more experience from that regard, and just gives you that sense of, you know what, when the game gets close and down to the wire, like, we feel we can still be in this. We feel like we can still be a part of this, which is something that's obviously very, very important, especially when you get into some of those tight games. But we saw that flash of what U of T could be and what this offense could potentially look like, in particular with that Waterloo game. For those who don't remember, that very first game of the season, the home opener at Waterloo, Toronto came away with that victory 31-29. And then for the rest of the season there, they only cracked double digits 3 more times in scoring. So lots of things to be desired there. Lots of youth on this team for sure, but really don't think that we saw the upper echelon of what this team could be.
Definitely not, but I think we saw bits and pieces where we could see the vision, and especially where you contrast having a coach in Bob Mullen as the defensive coordinator, who, again, the probably Hall of Fame sideline swag of
Oh
of
my
all
God.
sports. Do yourself a favor and tune in and pay attention to the man with the upside down, backwards, or front facing visor on UofT game days. But some familiarity on the defensive side of the ball, though, of course, a defensive year that was riddled with injuries, to say the least. I mean, Ryan Stewart, being a guy who led the OUA or was up amongst the top OUA tacklers, again, across all the OUA going back to the 2023 season. And then he misses the majority of this year, to the point where I forget the game where he came back into action. We're like, oh my God, of course, Ryan Stewart. And but some younger guys too, with a guy in Ilya Linney, who's been a really nice piece for them in that linebacking core. But getting to see Kinsell Phillip move over to the defensive side, and we'll talk about him momentarily. On the offensive side, kind of the flip script of that, where not just a young team in general, but the biggest just light bulb moment. We're going into this year thinking, okay, word on the streets, they moved Kinsale to the defensive side. I guess that means they really trust Scott Barnett. Bit younger than Kinsale. Kinsale's probably better, but maybe you're saying, just where we're at as a program, let's invest in the younger guy. Kinsale can pay dividends on the defensive end. He certainly did. And then we see not number 17 with the ball in his hands, but number 16, Team Ontario alumni in Caleb O'Donohue, And, we'll get into the details. We'll go through all the games, but just sticking with that Waterloo game, and we saw it certainly come up into other games as well, where we obviously mentioned on this pod that we just talked to K Mac, and that was our first time seeing him coach up the defense for Waterloo. And as we assumed his defense would be with Waterloo, as it's been in past iterations of K Mac defenses, they were aggressive. And what was so great seeing the way that Coach Kanichis was dialing up that offense is I got a young quarterback here. I got a team that's going to bring pressure. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take one of the fastest men on the whole country, in Chris Joseph, and I'm getting him across the middle and just get the ball in his hands. And that's where they were getting those explosive plays. So, that's just in the instance of that one game. And again, we can go through the schedule, but Caleb O'Donoghue, and I think how impressive it was off the jump with both the first year offensive coordinator, the first year quarterback, and then this young receiver with flames shooting out in his ass, going against an aggressive defense and just saying, look, here's how we're going to move the ball against them. And I thought it was, I think we were right to be like really bullish on them, like bar in mind, like, okay, they were in their league, they were in their tier against Waterloo, but of like, okay, like this is smart football. And it worked obviously as good as any football they had played all year. It was their only win. Obviously, we'll move into the other games, but like that was a really exciting game. I mean, it was an exciting game, but like from the standpoint of being like, wow, something's happening here.
Yeah, when you watch that game, you and I are both going, oh my goodness, look at these guys move. Who is this Chris Joseph guy and why is he so damn fast? And exactly like you're saying, it's not these over the top bombs that Caleb O'Donoghue is throwing. It's a simple crossing route. Chris Joseph just grabs it and just outruns everybody. He gets to the sideline. He's up the sideline. I mean, in that game against Waterloo, he had 6 catches for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was a massive game for him. There was also the 2 touchdowns that Caleb O'Donoghue threw. So there was a lot of things going really well for this squad here. And I think that win in particular and that style really lent itself into how the rest of this year was going to go offensively. We saw a lot of those same kind of crosser routes, just trying to get the ball out quick. Saw a number of teams still continue to bring a lot of pressure, including a team like Western. And obviously that Western game certainly got away from them. But even going back and watching that game, you're seeing they're sending 5, 6, 7 guys at the point of attack here to try to get this young quarterback flustered. And that's exactly what those quick out routes or crossing routes are for. Get the ball out quick, get it into the guys of your receivers. But suddenly, soon after that game happened, after that Waterloo game, teams got wise to that. You saw those linebackers, instead of sitting at 5 or 6, they're sitting at 7, 8, or 9, keeping everything in front of them and then coming downhill to make those tackles as soon as that's happening here, or having a half do something similar. So there's a lot of things that are left to be desired from this team, but there's a lot of really great pieces here. You mentioned Caleb O'Donoghue, you mentioned Chris Joseph. I really loved Jack Nyros. I think he has, at that running back position, really showcased a lot of great stuff. You and I were going into this thinking it was going to be the Lucas Stoikos show. And while certainly Stoikos was able to do a lot of great things, and not just purely as a running back, but also showcasing some stuff in the receiving end, I love to see that kind of ground and pound attitude from Jack Nyros, who was very clearly not afraid to put his head down and to try to get a few more extra yards here, albeit that run game really wasn't where I'm sure U of T wanted it to be.
Definitely. And, like Stoikos, again, is just such a great, like, I've never had the opportunity to meet him, but you can just imagine how much a guy like Coach Kanichis just loves having him in the system where they'll put him anywhere because he has the athleticism, the football smarts, great in the return game for them. And honestly, I think this is a UofT team that will, I think, surprise a lot of people next year. And we'll talk in a little bit about some of the names on this team who got the invite to the CFL Invitational Combine, including one Kinsell Phillip being perhaps the most prominent name of being like, man, if it's obviously great if he goes to the next level, but boy, would they love to have him back. But again, thinking about the youth and thinking about the fact that when we talk about the passing attack, specifically the connection in that first Waterloo game. And the only problem with being able to say like, wow, what a great game. And Chris Joseph gets the 2 touchdowns. Those are the only touchdowns he had all year. And then you look at Caleb O'Donoghue and the production that he had. You also have to factor in the aspect that Jake Oseen spent most of the year banged up, dealing with what looked like an upper body shoulder injury and missed 2, 3 games altogether. And yes, I love what Jack Nyros did, but the start of the year, it certainly looked like Garrett Ellis as far as like, again, Stoikos can do a little bit of everything, but as far as who are you actually labeling as the running back, RB1, looked like that's Ellis. He ends up playing in 2, 3 games. So just from the standpoint, and we saw great things from him, much like we saw with Jake Oseen. And so I'm just thinking about all these things of, okay, like a good year in the passing game where you're really limited. We see a young guy in Thomas Roberts step up in Jake Oseen's absence with the injuries. Obviously, as you alluded to, we see Nairo step up, and you just think to yourself, man, if we can just catalog that and just bank on the fact that, man, offensively, and I don't know, I'm not going to go through all the numbers. Like it was a poor year for them offensively. It was a poor year defensively. Again, it's a 1-7 year, but it's a first year, new coach, new OC. And then you add in these injuries, you add in the guys who got the experience as a result of it. And I'm just like, man, O'Donohue with a full year under his belt now. Ellis and Nyros in the backfield. If Stoikos is back for a year as that all-purpose weapon, Oseen, Joseph, and if Roberts takes a leap now as another young guy, like that's a nice, well-rounded looking offense. And of course, offensive lines where it all begins, where it all starts, where it all matters. We're recording a day after the Super Bowl where, if you had any doubts that offensive lines matter, go back and watch that tape if you can stomach watching such a terrible football game. But again, I actually look at this roster and I'm thinking, man, I think there's so much optimism and reason to be optimistic about where this team could head going into next year.
Yeah, and I'm exactly right there with you, even going through the offensive line, because once again, if we don't shout them out, no one will. Going through at right tackle, Gavin Himian, Jr., second year eligibility. Benedict Adri, second year eligibility at right guard. Center, Sebastian Holden, third year of eligibility. Left guard, Devin Dinza, third year. He is in his fifth year of schooling, if I get that right, but he is just in his third year of eligibility. He could technically come back. And then obviously the stud at left tackle, Jacob Wright, who is one of those guys who is being offered into the CFL Invitational Combine, which we will get into as well. But for the most part, a very young offensive line, and certainly on that right side at bare minimum, a lot of time in order to get more on the same page. You and I both know, we've mentioned this a number of times, how important it is to have that chemistry as an offensive line unit. The amount of stunts and blitzes that you will see that require you to work with the guys, not just right next to one another, but across the offensive line here. If you're going into a slide protection, not to talk too much about offensive line here, but if you're going into a slide protection here, if you don't have your counts right, if you don't have the guys you're supposed to get to, you can have breaks down the line of scrimmage. We saw that a couple of times. There's one that's sticking out to me in particular in the McMaster game, where I believe it was a zone run scheme and a guy got in free. But with that extra years of chemistry, with that extra year of knowledge, of playing experience, that's going to mean so much, and especially to an offensive line unit that could return potentially all 5 starters, which would be a huge asset to especially a young guy like a Caleb O'Donohue, who will himself have another year under his belt, understand his offensive line a little bit better, strengths and weaknesses, and where he can really take off in the pocket, because he does have a decent set of legs as well. Having that chemistry on the offensive side is really going to lend itself in very nicely.
Most certainly. And you're reading off some of the young players on that offense and the offensive line, flipping the script, looking at a couple of the guys across the board who, again, from where we sit, and the same thing we did last year, there's only so much insight we have that we kind of have to read the tea leaves of the roster pages from the previous season. And even then, it still doesn't necessarily mean anything. So, just looking at the guys who were fifth-year eligibility, where as certain as anything, I think we can say these guys are probably done. We're looking at 2 defensive players and Jeremy Sinclair on the and Keenan Dell on the defensive line. And again, respect to those two, but not names that necessarily jump off the page with these two teams. Big salute to you guys. Like, well done. Like, great job, part of this UofT run that's been up and down, but it's shown some promise over the year. Looking at some of the fourth-year guys, we do see the likes of Kinsale, who also happens to be in his 6th year academically, which, again, somewhat, concerning, right? I mean, not from the standpoint that he's spending 6 years. He's a philosophy major. I was a philosophy major as well. Like, you
Hey,
get more.
Listen, Listen, if we're talking about according to this anyways, a what do you Van Wilder type moment here. I see a Joshua
Yeah, I was
Carter
looking at the same thing.
in his fourth year and eighth year of schooling in arts and science.
Man, just living the dream, man. You know, the further I get away from undergrad, the more I miss it. But hey, going back to Kinsale, philosophy out there causing more CTE than the football game itself. But, you know, also Ryan Collins, linebacker in his fourth year eligibility, fifth year academically. Jake Oseen, fourth year as well. Owen Cassie at defensive back. Luke Stoikos, you mentioned Jacob Wright's name already. A few other guys, but just as far as some of the ones that stand out. So those are the ones that are the most sort of in that gray zone right now as far as you can't read too much into it, but it's like, you know, you're not really surprised one way or the other. And, you know, we do want to talk about the combine and everything like that. I do want to, though, you know, again, we look at the schedule and, you know, the only other game I suppose that is worth talking about in some capacity, much like we did with the Waterloo game. I mean, we can go into the X's and O's of that Guelph game and how, you know, they started to run all of these screen looks and bubble screens and Guelph shutting that down. And again, I just think with this team a year healthier and with those weapons back, it just opens up so many more options. And when Coach Kanichis was on the program, much like what Coach McNeil talked about, you slowly open up the playbook, you evolve, you get more in depth as you go along, as one should. But we'd be remiss to not at least comment on the Battle of Toronto, the Red Blue Bowl, the Argo Cup, the Matt Dean's Bowl, as it's been so affectionately titled by our colleague and brother Dakota Vine. Because man, what a bummer of a loss for U of T, and it really, like, you know, and we had the pleasure of getting to talk with Coach Deans when we were at a Football Ontario event recently up at York, and he was kind of mimicking what I'm sure a lot of people knew to be the case, which is like, just don't let Avante McCoy break one big. Just don't let him get loose. And of course, it's that major run that, you know, obviously gives them the lead. It comes down to the wire, onside kicks. It was quite an exciting finish to that game. What are some of your memories of the Red and Blue Bowl, Argo Cup, Battle of Toronto, Matt Dean's Bowl 2024 edition?
I think just naturally, you and I are both offensive guys. I think we tend to lean more on the offensive side when we're really breaking things down. Certainly where our strength for the most part is, not to say that we don't know defense, but certainly what we look for. And yeah. But I think this game in particular was a great showcase of the defensive battles that both of these teams have, and especially a lot of the guys in this one. So obviously from the York side of things, we'll dive deeper into that, but a guy like Brody Clark having like 12 and a half tackles, Peyton Ryder with 11 and a half is just insane. But
Just absolute dudes,
just
absolute
units
certified.
as
Yes.
well. Like the football dudes, man. To give you guys a good comparison on the opposite side, on the UofT side, the leading tackler, Lachlan Scardina, excuse me. I don't know why I couldn't say that. 5.5 tackles. So 5.5 to 12 and a half, huge jump there, obviously, but the UofT defense obviously stepped up as well. Joshua Carter with another 5 tackles, Eli Linney, another 4. So the defensive side of things I thought was really outstanding. Now, both of these squads had struggling offenses at times for sure, but I liked what I saw from both of these defenses really stepping up when times needed. I think it lends itself pretty well to almost the style and what both of these squads are capable of. I think at any given point with this York team, especially with the guys that you and I have been watching for a while now, Melchus Alunga, Rex Walker, Davey Ford, but especially in Avante McCoy, those guys, there's certain guys on that York team where as soon as they touch the ball, big plays can happen. And certainly we saw Chris Joseph in that first game in Waterloo, like we talked about a few times. But I don't associate Toronto with that big play, instant scoring ability. And that's where York kind of came in. And obviously that big touchdown from Avante, like you said, helped them get over the edge in that way.
Yeah, and it's it's funny, and again, I think you're absolutely right, and I think just a healthy receiving core and a more stable running attack, and I think like this, we're going to talk about the future of UFT and what we project a bit more detailed momentarily. But it's funny, I'm thinking as I hear you say that, where I'm like the whole, you know, like Tommy Dennison run era of UFT football was totally predicated on the fact that like, hey, we're not going to try and do much else other than the fact that if we connect on three, four of these big shots, then you know what? We'll be okay. So, interesting to see how the table is turned on that one. But I think we want to now just pivot quickly to mention the names who are going to the
Mhm.
Invitational. Tom, do you have the list in front of you currently?
I do. Couple of big names in this one that really, to me, stick out more than anything. And I really love that I've had a soft spot for Kinsale Phillip. And because of all of the incredible stuff that we've seen from him over the past couple of years here as well. I mean, to have a guy who was such a stud of a player at quarterback. And when I think it was 2022 when we're watching U of T upset Carleton in 2023. Excuse me, at home, and we're seeing Kinsale Phillip and everything that he's able to do, and we're like, oh my God, this is incredible. And to see him take that and transition that from offense over to defense has been incredible. But not just to focus on him, the names of everybody going Kinsale Phillip, Owen Casey, Ryan Collins, Lucas Stoikos, and Jacob Wright. All of the individuals from U of T that have been invited to the CFL Invitational Combine at Waterloo on February 28th. Very excited for all of those young men.
Most definitely. And just on the Kinsale conversation, it's so similar to I feel like when you see uh, a defensive lineman go to a combine. Obviously, he's yet to be at the combine yet, but like a defensive lineman go to a combine and you say, "Hey, look, like how about you learn to play the other side of the ball?" And of course, with
Mhm.
Canadian quarterbacks, like there's always been that bias that you might have more success at other positions. Except obviously, there's been a lot of excitement over the last couple of weeks about a particular Canadian quarterback who, I think we've maybe talked about and talked with a few times here. I think
Couple
he's pretty good
times.
at football. Yeah,
Yep.
Dutch
Couple
rifle.
times. Yep. Yep.
But the like yeah, part of that, Canadian quarterback bias, what have you, but also like you see the other side better, right? You understand what, like for someone who's played quarterback their whole life and now sitting in the secondary, like you think about the understanding of route concepts and like what a quarterback's progressions are and how they're trying to like attack you to now go on the other side of the field, like to go on slightly a bit of the way back machine. Like, we had a guy also from the West Coast in Mikey Carney who came in as a quarterback, went to the defensive side of the ball and was a star for us there, right? And I just remember talking about it. It was like totally a boon for him having that knowledge of the quarterback position. So, hoping all the success for him, like the athleticism's obviously there. We saw it when he was a quarterback and just the way he'd be able to extend plays with his feet and then pick up yards if he needed to. And that threat that he poses there. And then to see him on the defensive side on top of all that be like, oh, by the way, I'm not just some finesse quarterback speed guy, come into the box and lay the boom on some dude. So I mean, like he's got the football IQ, he's got the athleticism, he's got the grit and toughness, and just it's he's a philosophy major. So again, he must be smart then. So really excited to see where he goes. But yeah, Owen Casey Collins on the defensive side as well obviously could be troublesome, and Stoikos and Wright as far as that offensive side. We'll see. It's always the bittersweetness of like getting the guy to the next level and recognizing that it's a good thing for your program, but in the long term, but in the short term, obviously you got to fill those shoes. I think we wanted to acknowledge, just because this list came out, yes, the head nod is helpful there, because this list came out after we had spoken with Coach McNeil, that of course this list has more than just UofT players on it, and then we won't go through every OUA name at this moment. It would be worthwhile, or would be remiss to not at least mention the two Warriors who will be in their home dome for this one as well in Keyshawn Bowen at linebacker and Anesu Latmore, who we
Mhm.
spoke so glowingly about all year and was so great to hear Coach McNeil do so as well. Tom, any last thoughts as far as whether our two Warriors on the list or just anything else combine related on the UofT front before we continue on the exit meeting?
I think this is a good showcase of a lot of the strengths that we saw from U of T in particular. We talked about that defense in particular. I like Ryan Collins a lot. I think he's been a solid staple on that defense for the past couple of years here. And I know I already talked about him, but Kinsale Phillip, and exactly like you mentioned, it's not just he went from offense to defense and really stuck into it, whatever. It's the fact that as a DB, as a former quarterback, he was not afraid to stick his nose into tackles and wanted that contact. Man, the first time that I saw him lay the boom like that, I was like, oh man, this is my guy. This is my guy on U of T. So I always love to see the offensive lineman get some love as well. And that big left tackle, Jacob Wright, getting his chance to go out to the CFL Invitational. So congratulations to those gentlemen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just for Kinsale to be able to just show off that athleticism in the vacuum that is the combine will be sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, I at first seeing that list kind of hesitated because I was thinking, man, like, is it not Ryan Stewart's year? And just because the injury, upon second look, he's actually in his East West year. Whether or not he gets that invitation, I would certainly hope so. That the people who make those decisions can look past the fact that he had an injury riddled year and recognize just what a phenom he is in the linebacking core. So let's use that as our just jumping off point to talk about what next year could look like for this team. We obviously have done quite a bit of that already just in talking about those. I think we so many times I forget how you'd say it when we would talk about UofT, but it'd be like moments, right? Just waiting for them. Maybe they play a good quarter of football here, or even just a good drive, and just waiting for that all to come together in a full four-quarter affair. We talked a lot about these guys on the offensive side of the ball. We mentioned some of these names defensively. Just UofT 2025. What do you see on the horizon for this ball club?
I see the potential to I see the potential to return every offensive starter for U of T, which would be huge in that regard. Obviously, we just mentioned a couple of guys like Stoikos and Jacob Wright who are going off to the Invitational, and there's a potential there, but there's a strong possibility they could come back. Jake Oseen still has another year. He could come back. Obviously, Caleb O'Donohue, young guy. Chris Joseph, young guy. Garrett Ellis, Jack Nyros, both third-year guys is coming back. This is potentially their East-West year. We rattled through the rest of that offensive line to have the entire offense come back with another year under their belt, getting more and more accustomed to each other, and especially in this new offense with Coach Kanichis, I think that spells a fantastic opportunity for UofT. I mean, we saw a team in purple and gold that returned their entire offense. They seem to be doing pretty good. I don't know if they're going to see the same level of success that the Laurier Goldhogs did this past year, but it's only going to help. It's
Yeah,
only going to help. So I feel very optimistic from this side of things and seeing the growth of UOT football. But the other side of this as well, and obviously we'll get into the defensive side in a little bit here, but like you and I have been talking, and you start to look across the league and you start to see, hey, look at the coaches that are across this league. Look at some of the players that a lot of people are getting. I mean, we talked about it previously. I know that this is the U of T pod, but Waterloo last year went 0-8, and you mentioned it at the top of the program. They just signed a couple of really stud players from the London region, and you and I are both eyes open, going, "Oh boy, this is going to spell some good things for Waterloo football." And you look over, and obviously you see everything amazing that's happening at York and Coach Janke and where he's bringing that program to, and we're looking around, being like, there's not a whole lot of just pure bad teams in the OUA anymore. And even the teams that have struggled in the past, your Waterloos, UofTs, and Yorks, they're all steadily getting better and better here. So it's almost like you have to get better unless you know, go with another 0-8 or 1-7 season.
yeah, most definitely. you and I were at a football Ontario event up at York a couple weeks back now, and I just think a couple comments just from that, and maybe we'll do a more elaborate football Ontario thing, maybe with some of our boys running that awesome program there in the near future. One was just how darn good these young kids are. Well,
Hmm.
firstly, how deep this team is. Like it was for both U16, U18, both having like 120 plus kids coming out. And, there was a few kids you point out being like, okay, that kid probably is going to walk away here being like, look, I came out, I give my best pal on the back, and good for those kids who do that and take that shot. I'm just not at the level of some of these other kids. But that gap of the kids who, again, amongst like 120 plus athletes out there, it's fewer and fewer, which obviously speaks to other aspects of better grassroots community coaching, things of that nature across the board. And then also talking to a lot of the coaches that were there, and a lot of them kind of joking about the fact that like, and I think, even with K-Mac, with him being a recruiting coordinator and someone who's been so stellar in that position of like, a generation past, even like when we were playing football, there probably were some programs that just not that they weren't recruiting, but they weren't not recruiting. I hate to use a double negative there, but you know what I'm saying? Like they obviously had recruits, but like it wasn't a main priority. Like this is serious stuff now, which of course speaks to again all the other magnificent things about the growth of our football, our game of football in general. So yeah, I think that's awesome to begin with, and as we've always said, and especially when me and Dakota, just him being another Toronto guy, talk about this, for either York and Toronto to just own your backyard would pay such immense dividends. But though, what I guess I'll add in as far as the, thinking about next year, and normally we do our way too early season predictions when the schedule comes out.
Hmm.
And that leads into our tiers, which are then usually even still too early because we don't get updated rosters. OUA, I'm looking at you. At the very least, when I look at UofT and I think about all the things that we've been talking about right now, and just kind of a glimpse of thinking about some of these other teams, I look and I say, okay, you know, not to spoil where our tiers might go, but you think about, all right, Toronto, Waterloo, York, Mac. That's probably a solid bottom tier from where we're sitting right now. Maybe one of those four take a leap. Maybe one of those four, something happens and they really fall off. And maybe they all take a leap. And again, it's a really strong 1 through 11. And I think, okay, could Toronto be the top of that? I absolutely think that could be the case. And then you say to yourself, well, from 1 to 7 to maybe maybe a 3 and 5, that looks really nice. But the question is, if you're going to say, can we make the playoffs? It's who are you then stealing a game from of the other 7 teams out there? And I don't know, aside from the fact that any given Sunday mentality, I don't know where that comes from right now. But this is the way too early, way too early, way too early commentary that I'm making there. But I feel good in saying that, looking at them, York, Mac, and Waterloo, that feels right now like teams in the same neighborhood. I mean, it's kind of going to be validated by the order of teams that we speak on, save for the fact that Carleton was 2 and 6 this year. But again, we just know that Carleton team on paper is better than these teams. But that's sort of my commentary, that I feel like they could be the best of that group of teams from where we sit on bloody February 10th.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I love how you brought that up. It goes back to, a lot of the conversations that we've had around our top 100, and that's going to be changing up this year as
Yeah,
well.
sorry
We'll get
about
into
that, guys.
Yeah. Again, apologies. But we always say, hey, if you think that X player is better than what we put them as, who do you move? And you can look at us all day and be like, oh, U of T is going to be way better than this past year. Okay, who do they get those victories against? And exactly like you're saying, I wouldn't be surprised. I think they have the capability, certainly at bare minimum, to go to a 3 and 5. But past that, I just don't know where else this team can really go to for now. I think there's a lot of building blocks here. And when we put them in that, the tier, I can't remember exactly what we called it at this point, but
Winning isn't everything.
winning isn't everything tier, exactly like we mentioned. We wanted to see the building blocks. Are you building towards a brighter future? I absolutely believe that U of T is. I like I like Coach DA. I like Coach Canisius, the swag master himself, Bob Mullen. Unbelievable. I like where this U of T program is going. I think there's a lot of upside here. I just think it's going to take some more time before they really start to crack that 500 level, even getting to that 500 level, finishing a season at 4-4 type deal.
Totally. And in the spirit of like branding of what that tier's called, like I don't want to reach for like, okay, UFT, like this is the best of the worst tier, so to speak, because ultimately it's best of the non-playoff tiers. Maybe that's what that group's called. And then beyond that, again, you say, all right, do you steal a game from Ottawa or from Carleton, and then all of a sudden a tiebreaker puts you on a road trip to, Laurier, Waterloo, Laurier, Guelph, or Western to get your, doors knocked off in a round one playoff game. Like either result is good, right? And I think
Mm.
I think I'll give us a pat on the back for where we had them last year, and obviously it played out in the 1-7 record. But again, the fact that we can sit here a couple months off the season and taking everything that we're privy to, which isn't a heck of a lot because there's not much news that comes out all that consistently, and be able to say, all right, hey, U of T, next year there's gonna be some expectations now. There
Mhm.
absolutely are. And for good reasons, because the right people are in place. We've seen it, and we've kind of seen it manifest, and see how that roster can grow. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited. Hopefully we'll get to connect with some of the coaches from U of T, get them on a pod to come, because obviously there is some insight. There's a ton of insight, I should say, we get from having those interviews. But otherwise, Tom, final thoughts on the U of T exit meeting for 2024?
We talked about potential here, and there's a whole ton of it with this U of T squad, certainly. I don't think anybody is happy with potential by any means here. And if you really want to put on your I'm going to be a hater kind of cap here, and you look at this season and the schedule, you say, well, Coach DA and Tommy, well, certainly Coach DA, Coach Canisius a few years removed, but they came from Waterloo. Do you know some insider info about the players who are there? Does that help you with that first game victory against them? And then you look at everything else, and like we mentioned, they put up 31 points offensively in that game, which was impressive. And to see Chris Joseph, and I don't want to take anything away from those guys, but then against Guelph you put up 10, against Carleton you put up 12, and against York you put up 17. And those are your next big offensive, outputs. Even a McMaster team that you had beaten for the past 2 years in a row, you lose that game 32-3. So a lot of things in here that I'm very genuinely excited about. And I think that U of T can build off of things as well. But there's a lot of stuff in here that you got exposed in certain areas. You don't have a strong enough run game to really rely on that to give Caleb O'Donoghue enough of a break to keep teams honest, in my opinion, here. And while we loved what we saw from Garrett Ellis and Jack Nyros in the areas that they had, they didn't do that consistently enough. So there needs to be growth. There needs to be continued building blocks here. And I absolutely think that that's going to happen here. U of T fans, don't come for me. But I don't want to just talk about this like this is all peaches and rainbows at the end of the day. They went 1-7 this year, and I think that there's room to improve, but I don't know how much that's going to be. Like you and I have kind of been mentioning here, I don't know if that's going to be a playoff berth in the next year. I would love to see it because you and I both talked about U of T. When U of T football is good, all of OUA is good, but there's a lot of stuff here that still needs to come about and take place.
Yeah, most certainly. And as far as former Waterloo coaches, gotta of course mention Jamie Cook, who's now
Have to.
coaching quarterbacks with U of T. And since we're now naming additional coaches on the U of T staff, gotta mention our guy, Coach Ross Asaro, who runs the
Mhm.
best O-line, D-line camp clinic in all the country. So shout out to Coach Ross, shout out to my former teammate and Coach Cook, and of course, shout out to Matt Deans. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think if we're on the same page of saying that that's a handsome four that might be missing the playoffs, but within their own sort of circle could give us some really entertaining games. Of course, saying that the potential of them going 3-5 means that there's the potential for, in theory, 0 8 if we're saying that there might not be definitively a team that is better than them. And I think, as you highlighted, and I think as I mentioned as well, it's fair at this point to now say, again, whatever the conversations are happening in the locker room, as far as if they talk about, the playoff word in that room. But again, there's all right, let's see the growth. Let's see those areas of excitement that we're talking about here so early in the calendar year. But, football is becoming so much more and more a 365-day-a-year sport in this country. So, you know what? We got to talk about it. So that was great job by you, Tom. That's a wrap on our exit meeting for the U of T Blues. Really genuinely excited to see what they have in store, and just as always, one of, if not the best venue to watch a football game from at Varsity Stadium under the shadow of the CN Tower. So, Tom, we will be talking a little York Lions football, headed from the downtown Toronto team to the one that is just by pretty well one east-west street, hanging on to their right to call themselves a Toronto school. Man, Steeles is just protecting you, York. But we're talking a little York Lions football next week, and so we'll be here right for you. We'll be right there for you. Wow, it's been a while. Hey, we're at the 55. We'll talk a little York Lions football right here at the 55. That's all staying in, as is this.